one of the worst things that we do in this country is we try to force young children to read, many of whom are not developmentally ready for that.
Right.
Consequently, they start to hate it, right? And then they can continue hating it even after the point where they could learn it more easily, but they've been hating it for a year or two.
Right.
So now they just never want to.
Hey everyone, this is Yvette Hampton. Welcome back to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. I am back this week with Andrew Pudewa, and we are here talking about language arts. This is part of our series that we are in the middle of on teaching every subject. And so, of course, language arts is one of the most important subjects. I would say they're all important. But I mean, we have to know how to speak well and read and write well. And so in order to learn the other subjects, we have to know these things first. And so I would say this is definitely in the top couple of subjects that we need to be able to teach our kids. And so Andrew is here to help us through this. But before we get into our conversation, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, BJU Press Homeschool. If you're looking for great Christian homeschool curriculum that will point your kids to Jesus and everything that they do, check them out at bjupresshomeschool.com, and they've got every subject, every grade, every age, anything that you need for your homeschooling. They've got something for you. Check them out at bjupresshomeschool.com. Well, Andrew, welcome back. You were with us last week. And as I mentioned, we're recording these both in the same day. So we are wearing the same wardrobe. We'll call it wardrobe because that makes it just sound more
classy,
kind of classy and official.
Showbiz. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So we've got our wardrobe people, which basically meant me going into my closet and finding this shirt, and you probably doing the same.
It's my favorite blue shirt.
I know. I like that blue shirt. If you can't see in the video, for those watching, Andrew has very blue eyes, and so his blue shirt makes his eyes look really blue. And even Garrett said that sure looks good on you. So it's a great shirt. What's funny is I almost wore my blue shirt today. That would have been funny. I would have had to change it because then it would have looked a little bit too coordinated.
Classy or intentional.
Yeah, but it's like the exact same color blue.
The black and blue always go well together. So.
It does. Yes. As long as it's not a black and blue bruise, like, on your eye or something. Anyhow, we are here to talk about language arts. And I love this topic. I love to write, which is kind of funny because I don't write a lot, but I love writing. I have always enjoyed writing. I'm one of those people who's just naturally a very good speller. I have just enjoyed language arts. That's been one of my subjects since I was a little girl that I've always enjoyed and found to be fairly easy to learn. Science, not so much. I struggle with science. I struggle with math. But language arts has been a fun one. But I will say, and we will talk about this maybe later this week, sentence diagrams, parsing out sentences. Oh, no, that's not fun for me. So we'll talk about maybe the necessity of that and whether or not it is necessary. But let's kind of walk through all the different aspects of language arts, because when we think about language arts, it's the first question that I think every new homeschool mom asks. How am I going to teach my child to read? That's the scary question, for those who are not a kindergarten teacher, they're not teacher trained. It's the scariest thing. How am I going to teach my kid to read? So let's talk first. Let's kind of jump off into the topic of reading and the importance of reading. We're going to talk about reading comprehension, how to teach reading.
Sure. Well, one thing I would say in response to your comment there is it is much easier for a homeschool mom to teach a child to read than for any teacher, no matter how much training they have, to teach a whole room full of little kids to read at the same time. So, don't in any way imagine that you are somehow not qualified to do this. Most of the teachers who have been through, a teacher training program, degree, whatever, they may have some theoretical training about reading, but they get into a classroom and they have this huge spectrum of aptitude, and they may or may not even have good materials or methodology to do it. So you are much, much better off trying to teach your child to read, not really knowing how you're going to do it, than putting them in a school where some other teacher is going to have to try and do that en masse.
Right.
So that's the first thing I would point out. The second thing that I think is so very important is for us to understand that reading really is a brain function. More than an academic subject that can be taught and learned on demand. So you may have a child, let's just randomly say, just 6 years old, right? So right in the middle there. And you will discover that some 6-year-olds are very interested in reading. They start asking you questions. They start trying to figure out what are the words in their environment, and they're showing a readiness, right? Other children, maybe the exact same age, couldn't care less, aren't trying to figure out anything, have no interest in looking at words. Why? Well, they're just not developmentally ready. And just like all children grow, physically at different speeds in different ways and reach different sizes, reading is the same way. They are ready at different times. And one of the worst things that we do in this country is we try to force young children to read, many of whom are not developmentally ready for that. Consequently, they start to hate it, right? And then they can continue hating it even after the point where they could learn it more easily, but they've been hating it for a year or two. So now they just never want to. So, there's that oddity.
Sure.
One of the reasons this happens is because overall in schools over the last 100 or more years, reading instruction has gotten worse and worse and worse. And so there's been little waves and pockets of people kind of returning to the better way to teach with a good, solid phonics-based approach. But we've seen the look-say method. We've seen, the whole language stuff. We've seen the blended stuff. And so a lot of children are not learning well. And so what happens then is say, oh no, our second graders can't read. We better push it harder in first grade. Oh no, they're not learning in first grade. We better push it harder in kindergarten. Oh no, they're not learning. We better create a pre-K reading curriculum, which could be very damaging to many, many children. So I am always suggesting it's actually better to wait a little bit longer than to push it too early. And some countries that get far better educational outcomes than we do in the United States, Scandinavia would come to mind, they don't really push reading or writing at all till the kids are around 8 years old, which would correspond with what other kind of educational luminaries, Charlotte Mason, Marie Montessori, Blumenfeld, they all had this understanding that if you push it too early, the negative consequences far outweigh any potential gain. But again, you look at your child. If they're interested, by all means. But if they're just completely unengaged and tuning out, why bother? The other thing I would notice, and you just have 2 girls, but very often if you have a boy and a girl, you will notice that the girl will take to it at a little bit earlier age. The boys tend to be, when it comes to reading neurology, a little later, sometimes a year or 2 later. And that's not a good or bad thing. That's just the way they are. So that would be my first bit of advice is don't stress and don't push it.
So what are the signs that a parent should be looking for when it comes to whether or not their child is ready to learn how to start reading?
Well, they'll let you know. You're reading a book. They'll try to figure out words on the page. They'll look around in the house and see the things, and they'll want to know, and they'll learn their alphabet happily. And, there's just, if you spend time with the children, unfortunately, most homeschooling parents are spending a lot more time with their children than parents who have to send their kids to, another building almost all day, half the time of the year. You'll see that. And same thing with writing, they'll do. But one thing I'd like to talk about, because this is something a lot of people do not intuitively pick up, and that is the relationship between listening and reading. Right?
Okay.
Can we go there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you think about it, right, if you're a little kid and you're learning to read, you've hopefully been taught with a phonics-based method. So you're looking at letters, remembering the sounds that go to those letters, remembering the sounds that go to a combination of letters. And you're trying to then sound out a word. Well, once you do that, you have to kind of hear what you heard yourself say, and then you have to know if that is a word or not. So for young children, reading is very much the process of elimination. They try to figure it out. If they figure something out and it does sound like a word they know, they can read it. They can understand it. But if it doesn't, for one reason or another, they can't. So, example.
Yeah.
Let's say
I was just going to say, give me an example.
Yeah, let's say you're a little kid and you're reading along and you come to this word, and so you try to use your skills. You say slegha, slegha, slegha. There is no such thing as a slegha. Now, how do you know there's no such thing as a slegha? You've never heard it.
Right.
Right? So in your world, it doesn't exist. So you say, well, it can't be a slegha. It must be something else. So you stare at it a while longer. And if you're lucky, you recognize that EIGH combination. And you say, oh, that's that A like in 8. So let's try again. Sleigh. It's a sleigh.
Right.
And you're so happy because you figured it out.
Right.
But that only works if you already know what a sleigh is.
Right.
Now, how, as a little kid in today's world, how are you going to know what a sleigh is? Where would you ever have?
You've heard it in a book that your mom's read to you.
A book, a
maybe
poem,
a movie,
a song,
possibly.
A movie. I mean, you might possibly see a fake sleigh with a fake Santa and a fake Christmas and a fake mall, but I try to stay away from fake. So you have to have the auditory input of that word in context with some kind of definitional information attached to it in order to read it. So that's where a lot of kids are falling off, is they might be able to decode a word and sound it out, but if they don't already know the word, it doesn't make sense. They can't read it. They can't comprehend it. So there's a very direct relationship between auditory input of language and reading comprehension. And I think that's where we're seeing the biggest problems in the schools, is kids are spending most of their time with peers, with busy parents, or most of their time with screens and media. They're not getting a high level of language if they're not being read to.
Right.
If they're not getting the more sophisticated language, vocabulary, sentence structure, syntax, nuance into their mind through the ear. And that's why, I have been pushing for a long time the importance of reading aloud to children.
Yes.
Because that's going to create the raw information from which will come competent speaking, competent reading, and competent writing.
Yeah.
So the input cannot be neglected.
Yes. Yes. So good. Let's take a break. We'll be right back. Have you tried CTC Math yet with your child? Here's a testimonial from another happy homeschool mom. Amber said, "I'm absolutely thrilled with CTC Math. It's a rare find that I've used with my children for more than 5 years now. I have 6 children using CTC Math, and each child has found it easy to navigate and very applicable. Thank you so much for all that you are doing in providing quality math lessons for my children." If you're looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com. That's ctcmath.com. Join Apologia for the Homeschool Bootcamp, a free video series that provides practical guidance and wisdom from experienced homeschool parents. You'll discover how to equip your family for academic, social, and spiritual success. Plus, you'll discover how to build deeper and stronger family relationships. Homeschool Bootcamp covers how to break free from the public school mindset, daily planning, supporting students with learning challenges, homeschooling as a working parent, navigating the high school years, and much more. Find this incredible free homeschool resource at apologia.com/bootcamp. We are back with Andrew. We're talking about the importance of teaching our kids to read, of course, but then them being read too. And I know your answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it for our listeners who don't know your answer to this question. Is listening to an audiobook considered reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. The advantage of reading aloud to a child is if there's a word or an idiom or a name or an allusion that they might not recognize or know, you can kind of stop and explain that, define the word, talk about the connection. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is it's totally dependent on your time. And most moms I know are very busy and they don't have hours a day to read aloud to their kids. Audiobooks have the advantage that your kids can listen to the audiobooks while they're doing other things, you know, playing with Legos or drawing pictures or doing chores or whatever. Audiobooks don't get tired and fall asleep on you, right?
I have done that before.
The disadvantage is that the child is not necessarily going to get a chance to say, stop the thing and ask questions or learn the definitions. They're going to have to, which is why they'll very often be happy to listen to the same book several times because the second time through, they understand a little bit more. The next time through, they understand a little bit more. And so it builds the picture. So both are important. Both are good, but it's not cheating. The other thing I would point out is that children's understanding, right? Their auditory comprehension level of language is way above their decoding level of written language for at least 6 years. So they start reading at, let's say, 6 years old, and they're forced to read awful stuff like, you know, Max the cat sat, Max sat and sat. You know, the rat sat and sat. You're just like, ugh, this is mind-numbingly, insultingly stupid stuff. But you have to do that to practice your decoding skills. You want at the same time to be cultivating their imagination, their love of story, their higher level of linguistic appreciation through reading aloud in audiobooks. So just because a child starts reading on their own doesn't mean you should stop giving them the auditory input as well. And that'll continue up till 12 or 13. Their auditory comprehension will be higher than their decoding skills. And I'll give you a great example is if you let a 12-year-old child listen to Tom Sawyer, they can follow it and understand it and enjoy it tremendously. If you try to make them read on paper Tom Sawyer, the dialect and the oddity of it, they can't translate that into the language they would understand more easily, and they might not like it. They might hate it. So I think most of us have an experience of maybe having tried to read something that was just a little too odd and hard. But if we heard it, it would be a completely different experience. And, you know, it's essentially one's reading with your eyes, one's reading with your ears. You know, at some point, your visual decoding skill matches your comprehension skill, late teens probably. But I still, to this day, I listen probably 10 to 1 audiobooks over paper books that I read. And I will accidentally say, oh, I'm reading right now and tell somebody, oh, well, to tell the truth, I'm listening while I'm driving. But it's the same thing.
And you're not just hearing, you're listening. As we talked about in last week's episode, talking about music, there's a difference between just hearing and listening. And sometimes I find myself, because I also listen to audiobooks sometimes, but I'm a visual learner. And so I do much better. I like actual paper books. Garrett loves reading on his Kindle. He sometimes listens to audiobooks. I can listen to some audiobooks, but not all. It depends on the voice. It's the weirdest thing. Some voices, I just can't hear them. Do you find yourself?
Oh, absolutely. A good reader can make all A bad reader can destroy even the best book.
So, yes, I find that to be true. But I like listening. You know, I like reading actual paper books. You know, though my girls, my youngest one, she loves to listen to books, whether it's me reading to her or her listening to audiobooks. She listens to lots of audiobooks.
Well, and for younger teenagers, I think that if you want them to read a more challenging book, kind of a classic, like a Dickens novel or something, to be able to listen and watch the words go by on the page
Right.
can be hugely beneficial.
Yes.
Because just listening, they get distracted or lost.
Right.
Just reading, it's overwhelming and tiring. But when you get that double sensory input, sometimes that can really bring it up to the higher level of enjoyment, understanding and enjoyment.
Yeah. That's actually how I read my Bible, is I have my YouVersion app on my phone and I listen to it in the ESV version. And then I have my ESV paper Bible open in front of me and I follow along in my paper Bible as it's reading to me.
Yeah.
And I find that I'm able to much better comprehend what I'm reading because my mind doesn't wander as much because I'm getting it in through my eyes and through my ears.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's very, very helpful for me. Reading comprehension. Let's talk about that just for a minute. We're almost out of time for this episode, but reading comprehension, I know is difficult. You know, as I said, I have a hard time sometimes listening to audio because my brain just goes all over the place. How can we know if our kids are actually comprehending the things that they're reading or that we're reading to them?
Well, I don't recommend, worksheet style, reading comprehension test.
Right.
Because when people read things, they get different things out of it.
Right.
If you read Jane Eyre and I read Jane Eyre, and then we started talking about it, we would discover that I remember and thought about things different than what you would remember and think about. So that's why kind of a standardized reading comprehension test, I don't think is very honest.
Right.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that for kids, their understanding level is above their verbal articulation level. Right. So they won't necessarily be able to tell you everything that they did understand.
Right.
So don't judge it that way.
Right.
But I think the most important thing is to engage in conversation. And so it's best if you are familiar with the book that the kid is reading. If you have time, read along with them.
Sure.
If not, then try to figure out enough that you can ask them some good questions and let them tell back. What do they remember? What was significant? What was funny, interesting? What was hard? And really, if something is worth reading, it's going to be a bit challenging and it's going to require more than one reading to get full value out of it. Definition of a classic. We mentioned this in the music segments where a classic is something you can read or experience again and again and again and again and get more out of each time. That's why you'll see some children. I had one daughter, she would read the entire Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series, all of the Narnia books. And then she would go back and read through them all again. And then she would go back and read through them all. She spent a whole year, basically, all her spare time just... And I remember my wife saying, do you think we should make her read something else? I said, I don't know. She's just a little kid. She wants to live in Narnia.
Right.
What's wrong with that?
Right.
So that would be the other thing is don't be afraid if kids want to camp out in one book for what seems like a long period of time. Sometimes, more time in one book would be better than less time in more books.
Right. Yeah. One last question when it comes to reading, and then we'll continue on with the conversation tomorrow. But in regards to reading, I know that a lot of moms get very nervous when their kids are not sitting still, crisscross applesauce on the floor, looking at them, paying attention, quote unquote, because it seems like they're distracted if they're doing something else. Talk about the importance of kids. Sometimes they need to be doing something with their hands. They need to be what seems like distracted in other ways in order to be able to actually listen and comprehend what's being read.
Think about yourself in an audiobook.
Yeah.
Would you just sit there and do nothing?
Right.
You'd be more likely to get distracted and not hear what you're listening to.
Right.
Whereas, I particularly find that driving, cleaning, and cooking or exercise are really good for listening.
Right.
Because I'm using my body and doing things in a nonverbal way.
Right.
That causes me not to be distracted so that I actually get better verbal input. Kids are the same way. So they can play with blocks or Legos or color or, if the girls sometimes learn to crochet or do needlepoint or something. I've even had people come to my lectures sit in the front row and pull out needlepoint or crochet.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that they know that they will actually listen better if they are doing something with their eyes and hands. So that would be, my son one time, he was very dyslexic. We've talked about him before, but he was in a class I was teaching with other children, and he was just doodling on this piece of paper. Everybody else is dutifully taking notes, and it's my son who's just drawing dumb pictures. And I stopped at one point, and I said to him, Chris, are you with us? And without even looking at me, he just said, do you want me to tell you everything you just said for the last 10 minutes? I said, no, okay, whatever. But
keep doodling.
It took me some years to understand that, but now I do see it very clearly.
Yeah. It's sad because when you think about a classroom, I used to be a preschool teacher, and I remember I would sit the kids down on their little carpet squares, and I would say, okay, sit, with your legs crossed and your hands in your laps and be very, very quiet and don't move. I'm going to read this book to you. And they would wiggle around and, now I look back and I think, oh, how sad. They just wanted to move. Like if I had given them something to do, but I didn't know.
You want to know something really interesting?
Yeah.
What is the primary function of the ear?
To hear?
No.
To listen?
No.
No, I don't know. Tell me.
Balance.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
The primary function of the whole ear system is balance.
Right.
So for young children, for them to balance their body and be attentive auditorily can sometimes be a conflict of energy interest.
Interesting.
And I taught a preschool for a few years. And what I would notice is when I'm reading to the kids, they would want to sink down and almost get, prone or flat or spread out.
Right.
Because then they didn't have to hold their body upright. So when you say to a little boy, sit up and do this, it's almost like, well, you're going to use all of his mental auditory attentiveness to sit up.
Right.
He's not going to have anything left over to listen or write or do math or whatever.
Yeah.
So very often homeschool parents will discover, well, my kid actually does better.
Right.
Slouched down in the couch
or flipped upside down
or moving, because when you're moving, you don't have to expend quite as much energy to balance your body as if you're trying to stay still.
Right.
The only reason preschool teachers do that is to keep the kids from bumping into each other and creating conflicts, and then you never get anything done.
Right. Oh man. All right. Well, we've got lots more to talk about. Andrew, you are the owner, the founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing. You guys have all kinds of amazing language arts curriculum. Tell people where they can find out more about IEW.
IEW.com. It's an easy link. Yeah. And I have a podcast called the Arts of Language Podcast. And we talk a lot about all of these listening, speaking, reading, writing things. We have free lessons. If you go to IEW.com/free-lessons, you can get writing lessons, grammar lessons, poetry memorization lessons, other things.
Yes.
I don't even know all the things we have.
And you have several of your lectures on your website as well that people can go back and listen to. I remember listening to one, we'll talk about spelling, but listening to one several years ago on spelling, and you talking about stories about teaching your kids how to spell. And so we've used Phonetic Zoo for our girls.
You can go straight to YouTube and just search my name.
So
YouTube,
lots and lots of great information on there. So we'll put that link in the show notes. Thank you for being with us today. We will be back on Wednesday to continue talking about language arts and how to teach it in your homeschool. Thank you guys for being with us. Stay tuned at the very end to hear what's coming up next on the podcast. And if you could share this video with your friends or podcast, however you're taking this in, whether it's by visual, video, or auditory podcast, share it with your friends, and it will bring the encouragement that they need for their homeschooling journey. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you back here on Wednesday. Bye.
We've got an urgent situation. If we knew we were in a war zone, which we are because we live in the middle of a spiritual battle, we would not say, well, let's take a few days off while the battle's going on. We're called the spiritual battle. Let's step up and take responsibility for that.
Even if we're able to push the evildoers and the totalitarians back for another generation, if they've got the young people, it's over.
I often think about Daniel's parents, who you don't hear anything about. But they must have laid down the foundation for Daniel to be able to go into Babylon and not fall.
This is Yvette Hampton, host of The Thinking Dad. Join us for the first season at thinkingdad.net.
What's very interesting is we use the term creative writing. And that word creative comes from the Latin verb creo, which means to create. That's the one used in the Latin translation of the Bible, right?
Oh, yeah.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth from nothing.
Right.
Humans don't do that. We
Right.
don't create from nothing.
We're not God.
We have to have stuff.
Right.
Now, in the classical rhetoric model, the word used for thinking of what to say is invention. And that comes from the Latin verb invenio, which means to find or discover. And you don't find or discover something that isn't already there.